So hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the British University in Dubai. Our topic today is hybrid learning, and we'll be asking the question, does it actually work? I'm Dr. Tendai Charles, Assistant Professor in the Department of Education and Director of the Centre for Research in Digital Education. I usually start these webinars by talking about the centre, but I don't think I'll take away from your time today. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can click on our YouTube channel and have a look and see what we do. Essentially, we are the only centre in the Middle East region which focuses specifically on research pertaining to e-learning, online learning, blended learning, and digital education in general. So I'll be asking the question today, what do we really mean by hybrid learning? I'll then pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Christopher Hill, who also works here at the British University in Dubai. He's a specialist in transnational and international education, as well as all matters pertaining to e-learning. He hosts a podcast known as Think Education, and the title of his talk today is Hybrid Learning, Not One Thing or Another, The Challenges of Being in All Places at the Same Time. Following Professor Chris's presentation, we'll move on to Dr. Nadera Alborno. She's an associate professor at the American University in Dubai, and a specialist in inclusive education, particularly here in the United Arab Emirates. She's a member of the American Education Research Association, and the title of her talk today is Thinking Active While Blending. Following Dr. Nadera's talk, we will have Mr. Sam Kary. He's a former classroom teacher who decided to establish and found his own YouTube channel. So he's founder of the New EdTech Classroom channel, and he specializes in everything related to educational technology. I'm actually a huge fan of Sam and his channel, so I'm really excited about his presentation today. He'll be answering the question or talking about the key to effective hybrid learning. And finally, we have Mr. Chris Tuffnell, who works at the University of Wollongong. He's a specialist in instructional design, and he's also recently founded his own YouTube channel known as Blended Learning and Digital Education, otherwise BLADE. Chris is a good friend of mine, one of the few experts we have in the region in instructional design, and he will be talking about blended learning and incremental change management approach. So that's our lineup for today. Right, so to begin with then, let's try to come to a common understanding of what we mean by hybrid learning. Now, obviously, the educational technology industry isn't new, and academic research into online learning isn't new either. Some of my favorite articles and publications date back to the mid-1990s, and they're still quite relevant today, surprisingly. But obviously, over this time, during the pandemic, the entire world's been exposed to online education, and I've noticed that some of us are getting confused between terms and concepts, which are actually quite important. Prior to the pandemic, there was a great article published by Singh and Thurman, where they did a systematic literature review of definitions of what online learning means. And that really inspired what I wanted to talk about today. So we're going to look at the terms online learning, blended learning, and then specifically hybrid learning. And to do that, I thought it would be helpful if we saw a simple example. So let's imagine we're looking at a classroom at a middle school here in Dubai. Let's say we have Mrs. Johnson, and she's a mathematics teacher, and she has 3 students, Ahmed, Michael, and Sarah. Now, in a purely online learning context, Mrs. Johnson, she would be at home teaching from her laptop in her living room, and all of the students would be in their own individual homes online at the same time, right? So this is real-time asynchronous teaching. It could also be synchronous, but the important thing is that all the students are online at the same time. In a blended learning context, there's a slight difference. So there will be some days where the students are in class with Mrs. Johnson, and some days where they're online. So let's imagine a 12-week semester. We could have the first 6 weeks all on campus in the classroom, and we could have the second 6 weeks all online. Okay, so students are either all in class at the same time or they're all online at the same time. Now, where hybrid learning differs, poor Mrs. Johnson, she would come to class every day. So she would always be on campus. And some of the students would be in class too. So here we have Michael and Sarah actually in the classroom with Mrs. Johnson. But Ahmed, potentially, he has a COVID scare in the family, or for whatever reason, he needs to stay home. And so he joins the class remotely. And in an ideal world, the classroom would have cameras set up such that the students who are studying online can actually see what's happening in the classroom and feel like they're part of the learning experience. So that's the difference between online, blended, and hybrid. Online, all the students are at home online together. Blended, all the students are either in class together or all online together. Hybrid, some of the students are in the classroom, some of the students are online. Now, hybrid learning is incredibly challenging, more so than blended learning. And if you visit our YouTube channel, you'll see that last year we actually spoke about blended learning to some degree. With hybrid learning, the main problem that you have is classroom management. Right? As a teacher, it's very challenging managing students who are both on the cloud and in front of you in the classroom. We see that behavior management is a real issue, particularly in the K-12 sector. So you can imagine if you've got some students online and they're using the chat, you know, sort of sending each other naughty words or something, and you as a teacher try to deal with them, and then you have some students in the class, you know, throwing paper or whatever and being silly, and then you've got to try to deal with them as well. So, you know, managing the behavior of students both online and in front of you is not easy. There's a huge increase in workload for the teacher because you have to prepare materials that are suitable for both the classroom and the cloud. So in a blended context, I could say I'm going to prepare handouts, printed handouts for the days we're in the classroom together. And you know, when I'm online, everything will be digital. But in a hybrid format, I need to have both the physical handouts, if that's what I'm going to use, for the students who come to class, but also have a digital alternative available for use online. So it's very difficult for teachers to teach in this fashion. As you can imagine, there's an increase in multitasking, right? So managing the class with the students in front of you and also the things you're doing online as well. And we've seen many people come across technical issues. So I myself, when trying to do my first hybrid lesson, really struggled with playing YouTube videos, right? So for the students in the classroom, I could have the YouTube videos up on the smartboard in the background, but then for those students who are online, they couldn't actually hear properly what was being played. And so I had to then send them a link, but then you send them the link and they're watching the video at a different time to the students in the classroom, and it gets quite messy. So there are potential lots of problems that can happen in this hybrid learning format. Now, student engagement is difficult anyway in the normal face-to-face context, right? If you think about pre-COVID, that was something we would talk about, how do we motivate learners and get them engaged in the classroom. Then COVID happened and we all went online and students were able to switch their cameras off, so you couldn't see them, right? And so student engagement became a challenge there when they were online. And now in the hybrid model, we're bringing together both these problems of engagement. So we've got the students who are online, potentially, you know, playing PlayStation at home or doing something else, but then also the students in the classroom daydreaming and not paying attention. And so, you know, you're really challenged to engage all of these students in these different modalities. Right, student in-class retention. So I see this happen at the postgraduate level more, or university level. When students have a choice of coming to class or studying at home, you'll see at the start of the semester, they may come to class quite eagerly, but around the midterm point, they get a bit fatigued and they feel like, oh, well, I'll just stay at home and watch it, you know, I'll join the lesson online. So you can have a fall-off rate as the semester goes on. I think that's different in the K-12 sector. You know, students are sort of mandated to be there and the parents take them. But with higher education, it's quite easy for students to say, I'm just going to be lazy today and stay in my dorm room. And I think the biggest challenge for all of us is there's a clear lack in meaningful professional development training. None of us, or very few of us, have actually taught hybrid learning for an extended period of time, and so we're all just trying to learn from each other at the moment, and it's really difficult to find useful advice, which is why we have people like Sam, Kary, and other people like Chris Tuffnell creating these YouTube channels where they're sharing lots of tips and meaningful ways that we can engage our students in the classroom and teach in an effective format. Now, just from my own experience and some of the research that I've read, I wanted to share a few tips about teaching in a hybrid learning format, if that's something you're currently doing or plan to do in the future. The first tip is to try to build a sense of community with your students, because what tends to happen is there's an us vs them mentality. If you have students who are consistently in class and some students who are consistently online, the students in class feel like, oh, those guys are lucky they get to stay home, right? The grass is always green on the other side. The students at home feel, oh, they're lucky they get to come to class every day. I wish I could go to class. So there tends to be like an us vs them mentality. And the students online in particular can feel quite isolated, right? Particularly if they're, studying alone, no interaction with their classmates, etc. It can be quite isolating. And when it does become isolating, students tend to drop out or they tend to underachieve and underperform. So a simple strategy that you can do to facilitate that sense of community is to use what's known as team-based learning, whereby you essentially group the students together at the start of the semester and you keep these groups consistent throughout the whole semester or potentially the whole academic year. And each team would have a team leader. And so that team leader's responsibility is to check on everybody and make sure they're all on track and make sure they're all okay. And that minimizes this sense of isolation for the students who are online, and also makes the groups feel together even though they're using different modalities of study. The second tip that I would share is to avoid the technology entrapment. So we have two extremes, and you've probably seen this in your own schools and your own universities. You have some educators who are completely, non-tech savvy people, right? And so they feel overwhelmed by this transition to, online education and using technology, and they're just hoping to go back to traditional methods where they could teach face-to-face without technology. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have some educators who are tech savvy, but then they go too deep in technology. And so in a potential 45-minute lesson, they've got 7, 8, 9 different apps that they're using in the classroom, right? So it's a bit of overkill. And so I think it's important for all of us to remember and to focus on pedagogy rather than technology, right? To think about our teaching strategies, our methods, why we're teaching in a particular way, rather than thinking about which is the best app that I can use for today's lesson, or which app's going to be fun or exciting or has, bells and whistles for the students. So we should always think about pedagogy over technology. And I always like to come back to Mishra and Kohler's TPAC model, which speaks about this to some extent. The third tip that I would recommend is practice makes perfect. So I first started teaching in a blended format in 2014, and teachers were perfectionists, and I wasn't happy with my teaching initially. I had some technical issues that would happen in class, and I would lose, the students would lose focus. It would really disrupt the lesson. But also, designing instructional materials for online use was challenging at the beginning. And it did take me, a few semesters, potentially a couple of years. So I think I started teaching blended in 2014. It wasn't until 2017, 2018, where I felt like, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at online teaching now. It took me about 3 to 4 years. And so, we've been forced into this emergency online teaching situation. So what you produce isn't going to be fantastic, but it's okay. With patience and planning and practice over time, this will improve. And really, the final thing I wanted to say today before I pass it over to Professor Chris is the importance of rapport building with the students. Okay, so there's been a number of recent publications from Europe where they're looking at the effective strategies for online engagement, online teaching, and hybrid learning, and this rapport building with students at the start of the course is key. You can also see lots of literature about the concept of educator presence or teacher presence. And there's publications going back to the early 2000s about this, where students need to have this feeling of the professor or the teacher being visible during a course. So not just in the synchronous teaching, but even with daily messages, facilitating discourse in the learning management system, whether you're using apps like WhatsApp or whatever, or Facebook, social media to keep them engaged. It's important for building rapport with your students, but also for the students to build rapport with each other. So that's all I wanted to share with you this morning. The difference between online, blended, and hybrid learning, and a few tips to consider for hybrid teaching. I will now stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Professor Christopher Hill. Let me stop here. Okay, Chris, so whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Tendai. That's a deceptively straightforward description of the differences, which makes it, as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking, wow, this seems pretty straightforward. Like this is all pretty logical. You've mapped it out. And I remember back to you and I having quite detailed conversations before this term started, where we were facing the possibility of hybrid learning. And for you and I, probably for the first time. And I remember spending quite a long time in my memory trying to work out, well, how do we manage this, and what are we going to do, and how do we engage the people in the classroom? And we came up with some, I think, pretty interesting ideas, none of which we actually had to put into place because we didn't actually have to do hybrid learning. And now, having taught, what are we now in week 7, 8 of this term, I've listened to quite a lot of student presentations and student input who are teaching hybrid. And I think the only thing I can say from my perspective is, thank goodness we didn't have to do it. It is unbelievably complex. And I've seen a couple of questions sort of in the chat, and I think these are probably going to be addressed by our later speakers with, considerably more experience and expertise than me. What I'd like to talk about, I sort of came up with the title, neither one thing nor the other. I've experienced hybrid learning over the COVID lockdown period as a parent. So I've seen my daughter engage in hybrid learning, but mostly through sort of extracurricular. So things like ballet and drama and these types of things, where some children were in class and some were not. And the level of engagement there is very high because of the nature of the subject. And I've talked to a lot of my students who are attempting to teach science in particular through hybrid learning, and this is colossally difficult and raises many of the issues that you've already raised, Tendai. And I think that the advice you've given is excellent. When I think about hybrid learning, I think about it, indeed, when I think about blended or online or hybrid or even flipped, I come back to the point that you were raising, which is pedagogy needs to be at the center. And so what we need to do is manage the technology as best we can. We're fully aware that this is very challenging, rather than being led by the technology. Now, hybrid learning or online learning perhaps was essential during COVID, and hybrid remains essential, particularly for us here in the UAE, where we have some students attending in person and some students still at home. But if pedagogy is at the center, and I think one of the key things we've learned during the pandemic is to make it simpler. Particularly at university level, we've noticed the chunks of which we teach must be smaller, must be simpler. And that applies to the engagement level of online learning. So we need to think about the way we package information and the way we sort of structure our classes. And so the level of instructional design, I think, is critical to this. And I think associated with that is teacher training. Because what I see that's happened in the last just couple of months, really, for a start, and I really liked your presentation, Tendai, because I, like you, have been in meetings and conversations with people where we interchangeably use these words: blended, online, flipped, distance, hybrid, and in some cases, as I was talking with my students on Saturday, in the same sentence. And you think, well, that can't, yeah, so I'm just going to do an online flipped, blended, class, distance, hybrid. And you think, well, okay, maybe part of the reason we don't know what we're doing is because we don't know what we are actually trying to do. And so if we think about it as, in a sense, and fairly simplistically, about the way we restructure classrooms physically, so how we put small groups and how we engage. Because the point you make, Tendai, about the students online doing one thing, the students in class doing another, and how do you manage the two? And I think this is a very, very key issue. Fundamentally, this is true of an in-person classroom. When if the teacher walks to one side of the classroom and her attention is on the right of the side, the ones on the left naturally switch sort of focus and attention. So as teachers, we're not unfamiliar, perhaps, with this. We do have to, therefore, build smaller teaching blocks of activity and look for ways that we can engage. And I remember, Tendai, you and I talking about, so if we've got some people in the classroom and they've got their laptops, how do I make sure that the people at home on Blackboard can see me and them at the same time without me having to have one headphone in, one clicker out, one thing, and then you're focused on so many different issues. And I think it's interesting, like the parallel that when you start to learn to drive, at the beginning, you don't see the world around you. You're only focused on the car, right? You don't know that you're about to get hit. You don't know you're about to hit something. You're just worrying about the gear and the handle. And as you learn to drive, you can then finally start to think about the world around you, thankfully. And I think one of the problems we've had in the last sort of 12 to 18 months is many of us were not trained in digital teaching or digital delivery. And so that became the pure focus, and the pedagogy took a side. And maybe we need to flip it, which is focus on the pedagogy and use the technology, as our later speakers will show us, how to actually sort of get that message across. Because some of the big challenges I've seen with hybrid, on some very basic level, it's can you hear people? Because as the teacher moves around, the people in the classroom can hear, but she's not always connected, and the people outside, and so there's some of the practical issues between where the camera's placed, where the sound is coming, how much the teacher is allowed to move around or can move around, is the back to the camera, all of these very practical issues which require resources and support. Right? And that's something where I know you tend to have spent a little while testing out our functionality on campus, and it got there, but it's a whole different set of things that you have to think about beyond just the teaching itself. So I think on a practical management level, there are resources that need to be in place, and that needs to be supported, and that needs to be trained. But I think the biggest issue, and this is one where I don't know that we have a solution. I'm obviously very interested to hear what our colleagues have, and I've been looking at their YouTube videos, and I'm learning as much as I can, like you. This nature of neither here nor there at one time, and that the nature of hybrid as a sort of bridge solution to mobility, I think, is a useful one, and it helps not to disadvantage people when they are distanced. My question, I think, for colleagues is, if a hybrid class is not run well, is it more detrimental to the learning experience than the at-home students logging in at a later date and accessing the material or having a one-on-one session with their teacher? So what's the added value to the learning experience to having both sets of people in a classroom at the same time, even though half are physical and half are remote? Because if it's not adding to the learning experience, then we have an issue that we need to address. And so you and I, Tendai, like many of our colleagues, have done the blended version, where sometimes we're here, sometimes we're there. We've done asynchronous, we've done synchronous. We've played around with the models where our focus is on the people at one time. Irrespective of where they are, it's on one sort of homogeneous group. And again, we can have long discussions about whether they're really engaging. And that's true when they were face-to-face. Just because you were physically there clearly doesn't mean you're paying attention. So my query about hybrid learning is, I think it's not a necessary evil, because it's a valuable resource, and certainly when it's done well, it can be done very well. And as the students get older, it can be done better than perhaps at the younger ages. So that it's not a blanket solution. But I think what we need to really think about is how we manage it, how we engage. But I think the first question is, what's the point? Like, what's the purpose? And now, if the driving force is inclusion and engagement, then wonderful. Then we need to build around inclusion and engagement. And your point, Tendai, about community building, I think is the key. So we need strategies that allow us to, whether it's call and response, or whether it's to have groups that are made up of home and classroom people, so that they can interact with each other at the same time in the same sort of space, if not physical. So I joked with you, Tendai, that when you floated the idea of the webinar, and I've since joked with my students about this, that my entire talk is going to be hybrid learning. Yeah, I don't get that. I don't really understand the point, and I don't think we can do it. It doesn't really make a long enough talk. My view is still, it is incredibly challenging. And I don't think there is no easy solution to this. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do. There are strategies that you've highlighted, and our colleagues are going to highlight in a few minutes. I guess my rambling take on this is, when we understand the purpose or identify what we are trying to achieve with hybrid learning, we build the learning experience accordingly, rather than the other way around. So hybrid learning is nobody's first choice of a teaching experience. It's, very few people say, You're given carte blanche for your curriculum. I'm going to pick hybrid learning. That's not a very common sort of objective. So we need to understand the rationale, and then we need to build our activity accordingly, fully conscious that we are going to miss points of connection. So we need a clear lesson plan at the beginning. We need clear broken down activity. We need constant communication, and we need to, I think, simplify what we're doing. So it doesn't need to be, when you're starting out, particularly as a lecturer, you've often got 10 to 20 slides, and if you don't cover all 20, you feel like you've failed. And the reality is you've probably got 3 points that you should or need to cover, and the rest are additional value. So I think it's about simplifying the teaching message, building the levels of engagement, and providing our teachers and our colleagues with training about how to be in 2 places at the same time, which most parents and most teachers do on a daily basis anyway. And so it's about understanding our position within this process. So that's sort of to wrap up. Hybrid learning, I don't understand it. I don't really know why we do it. I don't really know how we do it, but it's something that gives us the opportunity to more deeply think about the practice of engagement, the practice of student activity, and the practice of community building. And that is a very, very good thing. So even if our hybrid learning classes don't succeed completely, what we learn from them about engagement and information will, I think, certainly add value to teaching across, whether it's face-to-face, online, blended, hybrid, distance, whatever it might be. And now I'm very interested to hear what colleagues have got to say and how we can sort of try to put this into action. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Chris, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Really appreciate that. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Nadera Alborno for her presentation. Dr. Nadera?
Yes, hi Tendai, hi everyone. Now let's try to see how I'm going to share my... Okay. Okay, so step number 1 is okay. How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nadera Alborno. I'm an associate professor of education at the American University in Dubai. First, I would like to thank Dr. Tendai for including me in this webinar this morning. Of course, BUID is a very dear place to me, and I'll consider it my home and my family, as I'm the first doctorate graduate of BUID. I want a quick special greeting to Dr. Gad and Dr. Farawi and Dr. Shamsi, because they're definitely my family there. All right, I move on to say something about myself. I'm at the American University in Dubai. We offer a Master of Education program, which is a teacher preparation program. And my research revolves around a teacher preparation for inclusion and diversity and the empowerment of people of determination in education and empowerment and employment. So why am I here today? Because my background is actually computer science. I used to be a computer teacher for so many years, about 13 years. And then I moved into education because that was definitely a calling. Right, so for today, I think I'm going to just start from 2 points that was presented by my colleagues. And I start with Dr. Tendai. You said that 2 solutions to the problems of hybrid learning is that we need to build on rapport and we need to focus on pedagogy. The same with Dr. Hill, where we talked that a hybrid is definitely not my choice. However, we have learned a lot from trying to carry on hybrid classrooms. And that's why what I want to talk about today is 2 things. I want to talk about active learning, engaging students through active learning in blended environment, and also how can we build our online presence, and that is definitely a requirement in any kind of environment, any kind of online learning that we are going to do. I think there was a question in the chat about that. So first, I'm going to start. I don't think I will give another view of blended learning because I'm focusing more or less on blended learning, although today is about hybrid learning, but really my focus is on active pedagogy. We're going to explore active learning in a student-centered classroom, explore technological tools to create an active learning space, and then speak about creating an online presence for the teacher. So for blended learning, another perspective of thinking of blended learning is to think about blended learning is that it presents a shift of the school or college from being a site where learning happens in specific spaces at regular times, materials that are usually owned by the institutions with a limited off-campus access, and the interaction is usually something that happens in the classroom, bounded within a certain space, and it's usually instructor directed, and the assessment is usually something that you do in the midterm or at the final exam. We want to shift this into what we call a service, a flexible service that allows students to engage in different times, different places, like what Kavanaugh Hargis describes here is that the material is available, and the material is something with the student is on the public domain, so it's available for students 24/7, allows the students to dig deeper into what their interest is, and the instructor is a moderator, and that kind of interaction with the students is not limited just to the classroom time. Of course, I put a question mark on that because what happened really throughout the pandemic is that we became really 24/7, and that is something that we have to think about our wellness as well as professors, because we definitely have become quite overloaded. As for assessment, then we need to think about assessment that is differentiated and that helps students to reach their level of mastery, rather than it is just a test at the end of the semester or mid-semester. So it is formative assessment in this flexible model, and formative assessment becomes very, we can do a lot of it throughout the term, actually in every meeting, because of the ease of doing it with online and digital tools. Okay, so this kind of environment that you're trying to build is to shift from a student-centered model into a student-centered, from a teaching-centered model into a student-centered model. So we are not just delivering material to students, but we are creating learning experiences using a blend of resources such as online videos from all kinds of resources, whether it's YouTube, whether it's discipline specialist services. For example, for education, we use a lot of teaching channel, TeacherTube and Edutopia. Or we can do what we say created tutorials, so we can actually record tutorials or record and put them so specific bites of information that we can give our students, and they can always go back to it to learn it, and that actually increases. It works well for inclusive education. Podcasts where we can bring in the expert inside the classroom, or actually bring an expert inside the classroom because we can use online environment. And all kinds of interactive digital learning objects that are available on open educational resource, such as Merlot, such as MIT OpenCourseWare. All these are resources that we can use in order, putting them all together to create a learning experience that is student-centered. Why student-centered? Because research shows that that varying teaching and learning methods and materials will improve retention and enhance the learning experience of students. And yes, we still need to do lecturing, that's for sure. And students need to do their reading, but that lecturing and reading need to be enriched with audio visuals, with demonstrations, with discussions that are going online, that are going all the time. So it's not just discussion in the classroom, but they can be outside the classrooms using all the digital tools available, practice and teach others, where students actually do their demonstrations and apply their learning. Right, so the pedagogy that I would like to talk about today is how now I want to move into the classroom and how can I create an active learning environment. For that, I would like to introduce or talk about the gradual responsibility release model by Fisher and Frey. Of course, it's an old model, and I think teachers in K-12 use it a lot more than teachers in higher education. And it actually is based on fostering student collaboration and creating active learning environment. Incorporates 4 stages, which is I do it as a professor, we do it together, we do it. So that's the guided instruction where I come in as a guide, and then you do it. The students will do it as a group collaborative work, and then we move on to the independent learning. This model can be very useful because it actually focuses on student collaboration, and it focuses on creating that active environment that the students need in order to enhance the learning. I'll talk about it more with this example. So what we're trying to move away from the teacher-centered learning into a more student-centered with this model. So we start with the first stage, which is the focus lesson. That focus lesson could be a curated video or an article that we actually give our students to read before they come to the classroom. This is probably the model that works very well in my classroom in higher education. Students will have to read an article or book chapters or some videos that I assign where they dig into the topic that we are discussing or the concept that we are discussing. Then we come to the classroom and we discuss it in the classroom. And that's the focus lesson, or that's the mini lesson. That's me modeling the thinking, me modeling the language that needs to be used. Now, this can be happening either in the classroom or it can be happening online. Okay, so it doesn't have to be synchronous or asynchronous. Then the next one, where we need the discussion, this is definitely needs to be asynchronous. It needs to be synchronous, whether in the classroom or online. I mean, on Blackboard or in actually the classroom. But that's a think pair chair, where students actually start thinking about digging deeper, maybe they're giving time to curate some resources and discuss them together. But with the guide of the professor, before the teacher, walking around, speaking to them, making sure that, and this is the time where you can actually differentiate, where certain groups will need more help or more advice, or more guidance on how to think about the concept. The next thing is the productive work, and that's the collaborative productive work, where students are put into groups. Those groups can either be in the classroom or they can be on breakout groups on Blackboard, for example, or on Zoom, using all kinds of digital tools that we will look at in a minute that are available for real-time interaction. Then from that, after going through all these stages, we can move then to independent learning, where students can actually dig deeper, maybe something more of interest, or maybe applying the concepts and the ideas. But again, even in the last stage, students still need our feedback, because that is a way of engaging the students. Okay, and as we said, although we said that this model has those 4 stages, but although they look linear, but they're not necessarily linear. Okay, so they can be, as long as we have them all, because losing some of these stages can actually affect and derail the learning significantly. So, for example, if we look at the first one, where we think this looks like a student-centered because the teacher is actually giving the student all the work and the student is doing independent learning. And we want students to become independent learners. But to become an independent learners, they need the first stages first. So an example for that is students might be given like study packs to complete at home, or giving some reading assignments, and then they need to answer some questions, and then maybe we give them some model answers to learn. But that takes away the collaborative learning, that takes away the active learning in the classroom. If we look at the second one, where we can actually, in the second one, we're taking away the guided instruction, taking away the chance to collaborate. Again, the understanding, we're taking away the chance for the understanding to be deeper. And the last chance, even by just taking away the collaboration, that means that we are taking away the chance for the students to become more of team workers and team members, and know how to collaborate in teamwork. What are the technological tools that I use in my classroom to develop my learning objects? In my classroom, I use Padlet, I use Google Jamboard a lot. Nearpod, I've used it once or twice, but I think it's used mostly by my teachers in their classrooms. I'd actually found out, and it's something that I really want to look into, is there Nearpods actually now has Nearpod Higher Education with a lot of resources, and it's a fantastic collaborative learning resource that allows the teacher, and probably it's the one that can actually support hybrid teaching more than other, because everything is in one place with Nearpod. All the activities are happening in one place in Nearpod. So I think it can solve some of the issues to do with hybrid learning. Mural is another technological tool that is amazing for visual collaboration. We use it in sessions of design thinking because it really helps that real-time collaboration. And Poplet, which is something I use a lot for mind mapping. And it's visual, it helps the students to really put their ideas on. The good thing about all these tools is that they are real-time tools, meaning that we actually can collaborate while we are in the classrooms or the students are at home using their online tools. I've just brought on here an example of me using it. Every classroom I have a Padlet because I find that it is very, very useful. Like here, for example, this is a class that I teach in a multicultural classroom. Teaching in a multicultural classroom is a course for students in their master's degree. So I start with, I would email them the Padlet at the beginning with some information such as a welcome message, the syllabus, and also a place where they can actually put their pictures, give like a little bio about who they are, what they do, their interests. So it's more or less of an introduction to connect. And I needed to use that, especially when we were completely online during the lockdown, because I was trying to build that connection between the students. So allow them to actually communicate on Padlet visually, answering and talking to each other, putting questions to make them speak to each other and connect to each other. This Padlet is one thing. The other one this was always connected also with a WhatsApp group that the students can also communicate with, to get to know each other and to connect with each other and to connect with me. So this is my Padlet here, and you can see that I have, later I would have a column for each class, for each session that we meet. And on that column, there will be all the active exercises that we do. Maybe I will be putting up a question or putting up a video they have to watch, and then they have to reflect on it, or maybe a certain simulation that they have to do, or whatever resources, whatever online resources, they can all be put there. And then I would ask them to keep curating resources outside the classroom and add it to this this Padlet. What the students have told me actually, that this Padlet has become very valuable to them as a teaching resource, and they actually kept coming back to it because it has all these resources all collected in one place, and the resources collected by all the students and by me. So that became like a very valuable resource for all the students in the class. Now, choosing the actual digital tool has, I think there's an explosion in the digital tools that are available. I like this here because it tries to categorize these digital tools according to the Bloom's taxonomy. We are trying to move our students from lower order thinking to higher order thinking, and this is one way of thinking about what tools can be used. There are many of these designs there. There are ones for iPads, there are ones for Android, for the ones actually on mobile phones even. So there are all kinds of digital tools that we can use, and we can think about what is a digital tool where as we are moving our students from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. Finally, I want to speak about, which is actually maybe the main point that I would like to make today, is about how can we develop, since we are whether we like it or not, part of our teaching is online. How do we develop our online presence? Now, developing our online presence. Now, what do we mean by an online presence? Online presence can be thought about as how can we actively and visibly engage with our students in the teaching and the learning process. And the online presence can be looked at as three categories: the cognitive process, the presence, the teaching presence, and the social presence. As for the cognitive presence, refers mainly to how can we clearly communicate our learning outcomes, content, and assessment of the course. How this content can be organized and stored systematically and clearly so that we facilitate access for all students. That is, again, very important in such. So access and engagements are both important. We need to consider all students' abilities and circumstances. Also, as part of the cognitive presence, is that our assessments are aligned with the learning outcomes that are given to our students. The other thing is that assessment is based on continuous formative assessments to inform the design and content of the learning experience. So cognitive presence is all about the content. How do we display it? How do we facilitate access to the content? How do you motivate the students to access that content? Using all kinds of digital devices. The teaching presence is to do with the instruction. How I am, as a teacher, going to create the experiences in the classrooms to make the classes more engaging. And in this case, for example, is what we talked about earlier, something like the gradual release responsibility model, thinking about how do we gradually release the responsibility to the students. So we model, we discuss together, and then they discuss together, and then they release to independent learning. This is one way, a strategy that can be very useful, using the Bloom's taxonomy and using all these digital tools and from the resources, from open resources that are available to students. The idea is opening the classroom to the possibilities of learning from outside, rather than the teacher being the center of the learning. The social presence, which is, I think it is usually the one which is overlooked, although it is the most essential to create successful learning experiences. Now, the downside of digital environment is that it can feel impersonal, artificial, and distant, especially when we poorly design those connections with the students, so they become disengaged and they lose interest. So what do we need to do? We need to create meaningful social presence. What does that mean? Creating authentic and consistent connections with our students. So, for example, an example is what I've just shown earlier, is that Padlet. saying something about, at the beginning of the year, saying something about myself, maybe in another classroom now. This year, what I've done is I actually created a video that speaks about me, speaks about my values, my interests, my concerns, my research interests. And that actually got the students speaking, because it's interesting to know your professor as a human being can be a very interesting point to create that connection. The second thing is to create, um, is to whenever we speak, whenever we design anything, the social presence means that I create that connection with my students, and I can only do that by knowing them. So I have to create opportunities within the online environment to know my students. And those opportunities, again, can be like, again, as Padlet, as on when we use Nearpod, as having those discussions, in order to reinforce the relationship between the professor and the students together. Many other things that we have to think about, things like organized office hours, whether they're online or face-to-face, organized feedback, and feedback on the feedback, just to make sure that students actually have read the feedback that you have given on their work, and video, utilizing video and audio conferencing. All these are possibilities in order to create that connection. But the main thing is knowing our students, knowing their interests, understanding their learning profiles, understanding who they are and their needs, so that we can teach them. Otherwise, we don't know them, we cannot teach them. So that's about online presence. That actually concludes my presentation. I hope I touched on the 2 points that I wanted to talk about, which is active learning in the classroom and building that rapport with the students and building that social presence. I look forward to hearing from you, and these are my communication channels where you can find me. Thank you very much. Let's stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Nadera, for the excellent presentation. It's great to see what the academic literature says. And I think I'm going to steal your quote, feedback on the feedback. I love that concept. Thank you very much. Right, our next speaker is Sam Kary. As I mentioned earlier, he's a YouTuber with a channel. And you'll find that actually he has quite a large fan base here in Dubai. When we advertised today's event, I received tons of emails from people saying, "Oh, is that Sam from a new EdTech classroom?" So, you know, we're really excited to have him here with us today. Sam, I'll now hand over the floor to you, please.
Awesome. Sounds good. Great to be here. Am I coming through for you?
Yes, we can hear you and see you perfectly fine. Thank you.
All right, awesome. And is my video is not flipped, I hope, is it? Can you see me on the video? All right.
What I can see it says key to effective hybrid teaching.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Just gave me a little view that looked like it was all right, sounds good. Can you read the text is what I'm asking.
Yes.
That's not backwards.
Yes, we can.
Right on. Thank you. It showed me a quick view of it, and it was not mirrored, and so it's
right.
You know, it was backwards, and then you wouldn't be able to read what I had written, so that wouldn't be good.
Right. No,
we see that to start off. Right on. Well, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, it's and thanks for that presentation as well that we just heard. It was great to hear you advocating for active learning, and I'm going to be talking a lot about that today as well. And also thanks, Dr. Tendai, just for the opportunity to come on. It's cool to hear that that people are watching New EdTech Classroom in Dubai. So that's pretty fun. So I'm going to be talking about the key to effective hybrid learning, but I'm going to give something away right now, and that's that every single thing I'm going to talk about today is I would swap out the title for the key to in-person learning, the key to effective remote teaching, the key to effective blended learning. To me, everything that I'm going to show you, those are all just effective teaching practices. A lot of these were actually touched on in the last presentation, just about how we can kind of think differently about how we get students to engage. And this applies far beyond just thinking about the challenges of, having some students that are coming into a class remotely, some students who are physically in person. Just a little bit about myself in case you're like, who's this guy? I am a former teacher of over a decade, an instructional coach. Even though I'm not a full-time teacher now, I do still work in local schools. And actually last year, I was a volunteer teacher in a makerspace program that was entirely hybrid in this definition of like hybrid concurrent. And we did full-blown makerspace projects where we had 3D printed objects that got presented to people, and it can be done. It's doable. It's just about knowing the tools that are out there and then understanding how to utilize those in the most effective way. So one thing that I am going to suggest that we keep in mind here is that when we're thinking about effective hybrid teaching techniques, that really what we're thinking about is how can we bring students into a digital space. So oftentimes when we're talking about hybrid teaching, we think of all these ways that we might want to bring students into a physical space, right? Or we want to bring a physical space to students. So we are thinking about how can we live stream our teaching, or how can we get it so that, when I'm holding, like I want a camera on my whiteboard so that that gets projected out to the students who are at home. And I think Dr. Tendai actually talked about this, that's always going to create this dichotomy where it's clearly better to be in person, right? Like you are, I think the analogy is, wouldn't you always rather be on the actual field trip than to go on like the virtual field trip, right? You'd always rather be on the actual field trip. So I think it's incumbent upon us in those types of situations to think outside the box about how we can bring all the students to an equitable space. That is a space where everyone can interact together on the same plane, where actually it doesn't matter all that much if you are physically in a room or not. You are still able to engage and participate just as fully as anyone else. So that's what I mean by bringing students into, a digital space as opposed to bringing students into bringing the physical space into students. So we're going to look at like, how can we take the whole class and how can we sit them down right here, on our computer. We're going to try to get all the students into this digital space. And the beauty of being in a digital space, just like right now, I am in California and it's midnight for me right now, but I am in the digital space with you all right now, right? Now, a couple of things to remember about what I mean, or just I should say to clarify. I am not talking right now about Zoom. Okay, so when I say like bring people into a digital space, I don't mean bring people in with video conferencing software. Zoom is just a video conferencing platform. It is not an instructional technology platform. So a lot of teachers, because we're not well trained in how to use instructional technology, are essentially trying to replicate traditional teaching practices in a program like Zoom. So you will see a lot of people who are lecturing right in front of a Zoom camera, essentially just taking the same practices that you would do in a physical classroom and trying to bring that to students via something like Zoom or Google Meet, right? I totally understand why. It's because lack of professional development, like was mentioned before, but it's just important to remember that when we're thinking about how can we bring students into digital spaces, we're thinking about how can we actually use instructional technology to do that. So again, I'm going to show some models that do apply to hybrid teaching, and I'm indicating hybrid here because I have these little guys here. So that's my, like, you're in person, right? If you're there and you're sitting in front of a computer, and then if you're here with, on the computer, that's the remote person, right? So this is supposed to be, representative. I drew this up in Google Drawings of of a model that a lot of people are trying to follow, right? And essentially, this model is a model of that we refer to as vertical planning, right? So vertical planning meaning that you're starting from the beginning of a lesson and you are moving vertically in progression throughout the lesson. So you might have a do now activity followed by some direct instruction, some group work, then independent practice where we're passing off responsibility to students, and then we have an exit ticket. And that's all great, but the problem with that is that if you are actually, in fact, let's even forget for a second about the fact that we have students who are coming in remote or not. Let's say you're all in person. I'm sure you've all experienced how incredibly difficult it is to have every student at the same place, working at the same pace, right? Students are not all at the same place. They cannot all work at the same pace. So even if you're in an in-person classroom, like totally traditional classroom, vertical instruction is actually challenging, right? It's still challenging. It doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We have to do it sometimes, but it's a challenging model to implement. And so it merits thinking outside the box about how we might do it. Now, I'm going to show you some tools though, and some strategies for how you could do this. So we already heard here about Nearpod. That is a great tool for vertical instruction where you need to be, and the idea is you need everyone to be there with you, right? So it doesn't matter where they are, like everybody needs to be pacing at the same pace, doing the same thing, right? Another program that I'm going to show you in a second here is a program called ClassKick, which is a digital space program, meaning that I'm not worried about what Tendai is doing on his computer because I get to see what he's doing in his digital workspace, right? So I'm going to assign something and I get to see that all in one place. I'm going to show you that in a second. And then, yeah, I'd love to see Padlet there as well. I'm a huge Padlet fan. I'm going to show you how you can run some lessons out of Padlet as well. There were some great ideas in the last lesson or presentation, so I won't spend quite as much time there. Okay, so that's one model. Now, another model, and this was also referred to in the second presentation, is just how can we actually think outside the box and not expect all students to be pacing at the same pace. And this is what I would recommend you do 9 out of 10 times, actually in a traditional classroom, a blended classroom, or a hybrid classroom. And it's to think about how you can actually break up your lesson so that it no longer matters as much the sequence, the order through which students move through the lesson, right? So in this case, you may have some kind of whole group check-in. If this is in a hybrid environment, this might involve like some Q&A, something like that, some sort of kick-off activity that you're doing in a program like Padlet. But then pretty quickly, you're going to move into some groups. And I'm also going to show you how you can structure some of this and how you could use some programs to manage these groups. Students would be moving through groups either physically, these could be in breakout rooms, these could be physical groups for your in-person students. They could be mixed groups. I'll show you some of that too in a second. And then once you're finished up with those groups, then it can come back to collaborative work or some independent work. You can have some kind of whole group checkout. Now, these stations may be lasting for a week, 2 weeks, depending on the content that you're teaching. So notice here as the teacher, you have some different options. You can either like park yourself at a station. So you could like run a station, which would allow you to basically do direct instruction. So you could envision if you're in person, how this would be if people are kind of rotating to you. If this is in breakout rooms, this could look like you are with one particular group and basically you're moving yourself to move to those different groups to provide them with some direct instruction, and the rest of the time, those other groups are working on something that's self-paced, right? So that's one option. The other is you rotate, right? So you're basically just popping around and you're kind of checking and you're seeing how things are going in each one, right? Again, this could be via just like physical in person, or it could be managed through something like breakout rooms. So when you're grouping, groupings can be different. I've used all of these groupings before. They all work in different ways. So you can have groups where you have basically just your remote learners. You could have your in-person learners in a group. You could mix those groups up here. And you could also do stations with individuals. So this would be like asynchronous. A person knows they have to move through these different stations and do these different activities, but they're not actually like in a group. So there's lots of different ways that you can pull it off. This is actually really like this type of grouping. We used this a lot last year, where you're grouping a student who is in person with the student who's coming in remote to kind of help both of them sort of understand the unique challenges of being in each of their situations. So yeah, I would recommend kind of exploring some of these and looking at how you might group students differently. Okay, so what are students doing, during this time? So like we saw in the last presentation, students might start here with some sort of whole group activity, like, hey, we're going to check out Padlet right now, or we're not going to check out Padlet. We're going to get into Padlet to do some fractions practice. Maybe it's a practice problem from yesterday where we're all going to norm on what we just did, or maybe it's going to be a quick mini lesson about the lesson that's going to come, right? And then what you'll notice here is that in 3 of these stations, these are basically self-run. So here, these are single activity stations. They don't have to be that way. They could be multiple activity, but this one is like personalized learning. So this would be a program like IXL or ST Math where it automatically levels up based on a student's level. And it's typically something that a student does like over the course of a whole year to sometimes remediate skills or continue building skills. And then you could also do something like use Nearpod. So you could use Nearpod to do self-paced lessons. So Nearpod is effective for both. You can use it when you want to hold the pace. So you're basically pushing out slides to students and they have to be on a particular slide, but they also have a self-paced mode. So you can use it for that, where you basically have a whole lesson and they have an archive of lessons. So you can just pull from stuff that's already made too. Or you could do something like a math game, things like this. So these are just to show you how you can do these different activities that are pretty dynamic and interesting and often adaptive. And in these cases, actually don't involve a lot of extra planning because they're already done. Like literally you could, if you were a math teacher, for example, you could just sign up for Prodigy, have your students go in and do an initial assessment, and it's going to take them into this whole game that they play, and they can play it all year. I've had students play it all year. And then what you could do is you could, say, okay, well, I'm going to give some direct instruction here, and you could park yourself here, right? Like just like I showed in the last one. So this one would be, maybe you're going to do strategic polling of some groups. Maybe you're going to do your actual direct instruction here, but you're going to repeat your direct instruction mini lesson a few times to some different groups of people. Maybe it's going to be differentiated. Can depend on needs. And there's also a way to do it flexibly, which I'll show you in a second as well. And then after, students are in their groups, you can have them do some type of activity that everyone is doing together. This could be a collaborative activity where they group back up and maybe they are individual or in person. So for example, what we did when we were in our makerspace in this stage is everybody started designing some 3D objects in a program called Tinkercad, and they were all working on the same thing. So it kind of didn't matter if like sometimes the groups were switching between in-person or remote, but then the end product was that they were all going to print that out in a 3D printer. And then another option is that you do a kind of in-classroom flipped instruction model. You could do flipped instruction outside of class, but I tend not to want to assume that students are going to do a bunch of work outside of class, so I like to just talk about it in class. So what that would look like is that you're setting lessons up to be self-paced. And actually a great resource for that would be to check out hyperdocs.co, which is a website where they post a lot of these documents called hyperdocs, which are basically like a Google slide or a Google Doc, where you might find links out to a lot of these different programs. And it's basically a designed lesson that, people have already pre-made. So oftentimes you don't have to go about making them yourself. Like after you use a bunch of them, you can learn how they work and then you can start making your own. But there's so many that people have pre-made. And then students are, moving through self-paced work. And the key is that when they're moving through all the self-paced work, you're trying to use programs that have these built-in checks for understanding. So all the active learning tools that were mentioned before, and that you're really emphasizing interactive content tools. So program like Edpuzzle, which is an interactive video program like Active Learn, which allows you to make interactive text. So that way, when a student is reading or watching a video, they're getting immediate feedback to know if they got the answers right. And you're also over here, you can see in real time whether or not this students were getting the answers correctly or not. And then you can either poll students strategically, so you can say like, okay, I know that you all are going to come meet me right now, and this could be a breakout room, right? And we're gonna do some instruction, right? And that's pre-planned, or it could be flexible. So you might say that I'm noticing, that these students are having some difficulty because you're just kind of monitoring stuff that's coming through. And so you're just gonna pull them over and you're gonna give them like a quick mini lesson. And again, that can happen through a breakout room is a way to have all the students there, there with you if they're remote or in person. Okay, so that's kind of the theory stuff. I want to show you real quick. This is a program called ClassKick. So ClassKick is free. They do have some paid features, but it's a pretty robust free program too. And what you'll see here is a digital workspace program. So each of these represents, these are all teachers that I worked with in a PD, but here's me. So I'm actually on my other computer, and you'll notice basically what I did. So as the teachers, I set up these 4 activities slides here, and then I invite students in, and this is, me, I'm on my other computer here. So what you'll see here is when I start typing, I'll put a vision board is, blah, 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 whatever I think it is. I'm going to see that coming through live, right? And then I can do all kinds of things. So I can give feedback. I can use all these different tools to like respond to the student as well. I can even do things like, let me move this out of the way. You can enable it so that students are able to ask for help, like raise a digital hand. You can jump onto those boards. So like, okay, that student's asking, for help here. I'm going to help that student. You can actually like give them some feedback. You can type them like, how can I help you? And you can even record video, audio response, so you could communicate back and forth. This can happen in a synchronous or asynchronous environment too, so it doesn't all have to be happening live, but it is really effective actually if you're going all the way back to this vertical planning. If you're trying to do this lesson kind of all at the same pace, because like you can see, they're mostly paced together, but it's possible like one student might have moved on, to the next piece here a little bit faster, but it allows you to see all student responses coming through in real time. Peers can support each other, ask for help. You can jump on, you can see students' responses coming through live. They have features like, you can leave these little stickers. So if I need to give a student some feedback, I can tell them here, that, and then they can send me a little video clip that says like, what are you talking about, right? So it's just, again, it's another way of thinking about how I'm providing instruction. Maybe I'm not standing in front of the class like giving a lecture, but I've given some initial instructions, and then we're moving into this workspace where I've set up my instruction here. So like I have audio right here that I pre-recorded. A video that I already put in there that instructs students about what a vision board is, right? So it's a really effective program for using as a digital workspace. It was already mentioned Padlet, but Padlet is super dynamic for this as well. And Padlet can be used for vertical planning, so you can kind of manage how how lessons get pushed out altogether, and it doesn't matter. As long as you have a computer, you can come in from anywhere. In fact, everything you're seeing on these are all done in a fully remote environment. If they're done in a remote environment, you can do it in a hybrid environment. It's also effective for stations, so you can set up a Padlet to be something that students are doing when they're in a station. And one key thing with this is that you want to set up things like video tutorials. So this was an activity that people did, for example, completely asynchronously, but I explained how it worked in this video. So I created a video tutorial, and this video tutorial, I'll turn the volume down so you're not. The video tutorial is basically just explaining to people what it is that they're going to do. So I'm showing them, explaining this activity, where the idea with this activity is that they have to post up why what they teach is important, but they can't use words. They have to use pictures only. And then in the comments, people have to try to infer what they are trying to get at. And then the final round is that they get to reveal for the group essentially like what it is that they meant, right? So it's actually a pretty dynamic activity. It has differentiation in it, inference, and collaboration, because they get to all like communicate with each other. So this is the result of the activity, where people were posting up, different images to represent why what they taught was important, and then inferences down below about what it meant. This is another example where, and I know the shelf was shown earlier as well. One of the effective things about the shelf is that you can continue to add sections to it. So what I like to do with the shelf is I will start a shelf activity with only one column, and I will know what I'm going to essentially like release, or I might have a couple columns, but I'll release that. So if I'm trying to do this live, that's the way that I'm controlling the pace of the lesson, because in literally as I'm teaching, I am adding a column, so I might say, okay, like click here, and now, I'm going to add this column. Now we're going to do like learn, whatever. And I'm going to put, an activity under there that I want. Now you need to go watch this video or something. And then I'll put a prompt, right next to it. So it allows me to control the pace of how things are rolling out. And so what I did here is I actually linked to other Padlet boards. So we started the day with a reflection where we did a mind map activity in Padlet. Everyone, again, doesn't matter where you are physically to do this. So they all, did this mind map activity, reflecting on what it meant to collaborate, what's challenging about collaboration. And then each of these groups that you see here, these are my groups that I would use like this. So these were groups that were all in basically stations. In fact, this was, I basically was never with this group as a whole group more than maybe, I don't know, like 15 minutes over a couple hours. Almost all the work was done in breakout rooms. And what people did in those was I created this document ahead of time. And so everybody knew their roles and their responsibilities for what they were going to do when they were in the group. I took some screenshots. So it involves some pre-planning and lesson design, obviously. And I literally walked them through step by step what they're going to do in that activity. I then gave them a video tutorial that they were going to watch. So every single one had a video that they had to watch, and then they had to do some activities for those different videos as well. And then I also, I created a structure for like asking questions and reflecting and stuff. So all I did during this time, the way I managed this is I just floated. So I basically went in and I supported, and I had very specific things for those groups. I had an expectation that the materials manager in the group, for example, always had to be sharing their screen. That every single person had a specific responsibility. So when I would go into the group, I would ask the timekeeper, like, how much time do you have left, in this particular activity? Or spokesperson, tell me, what your group has been talking about right now. So when you communicate to students what their role needs to be in those individual groups, then you can also hold them to that expectation, which I know is an anxiety about like putting people in breakout rooms and like, what are they doing? We need to like really structure it and have all these roles and responsibilities for them. And then, I'm just kind of popping in and checking in and seeing how they're doing, right, when they're in those groups. And then the last one that I want to show you here is just the power of digital whiteboard. So actually, since Jamboard was mentioned, I was going to show you another one, but I'll show you Jamboard. So am I good to go, Tendai? I know I'm a little over time.
Oh yes, no, we're really enjoying this. Please take your time. Thank you.
All right, cool. Okay, so, let's say you're thinking you have some direct instruction and you're going to teach a lesson. So, you want to teach a math lesson. Let's say you're going to do something like, adding fractions or something like that, right? Oh, get my pen. What's going on? It's not going to work. Let me see. That wouldn't be good. Okay, well, I'll write it on this one. Okay, so I'm going to do adding fractions is my lesson, right? All right, so digital whiteboards, they are superior to a physical whiteboard in every conceivable reason. And they're awesome in particular for hybrid learning environments. They're awesome for traditional teaching environments, remote environments, it doesn't matter. Okay, one is that, look what I can do right here. I can zoom all around, and I don't lose my work. So, if you have a physical whiteboard, you only are limited to what you can do on your physical whiteboard, and then you have to erase it, right? Well, this I never have to erase, okay? So you can imagine here that I have a lesson. So I'm going to be teaching students about the steps to adding of fractions. So I'll be, let's see here, do like step 1. And we're going to do find the LCM, right? Is the first step for adding fractions. And then, maybe I'll give an example down here. So if we have 2 fractions, by the way, I'm not a math teacher, so forgive me if I do, if I make some mistakes. And then we're going to, find the LCM here for my denominators. Okay, get the point here, all right? Okay, so that's, first step, right? All right, so, when I'm talking about how to bring students into this space, right? Like, how do I now bring this to students? All kinds of things I can do. So one is that I can just very quickly take a screenshot of this, boom, like that. And then I can go to, it sounds like you all have Blackboard. I'm going to show Google Classroom, but it doesn't really matter. You can add this, right, as material. So this is another one, just so I don't have to take the time to upload it, but there I just added it, right, as material for students to be able to reference later. Okay, so it just made that slightly more accessible, right? But take that up another notch and use a screen recording tool. So I know that that was also talked about briefly in the last presentation, but rather than just doing this, just hit your screen record tool and record yourself doing this lesson, right? Use a program like Screencastify, and Screencastify is actually going to allow you to add interactive questions directly to your tutorial. So you can see here I have a lesson. This is my completed one for adding fractions. And I've written out all my steps here. And then I've strategically planned, okay, here is a check for understanding question. As students answer these check for understanding questions, they see immediately if they got the answer correct. So you can check them on key ideas. I see whether or not students are getting the answers correct. So again, this is a great way, if I'm like here in the self-paced model, that I could have set my whole lesson up like this, right? And then, student's not there, student's doing it from home, doesn't really matter. But I can still see who's doing it, who is not doing it, who's getting it, who is not getting it. I can provide flexible support, and they're able to self-monitor. They can see for themselves if they're getting the information correctly or not. And then I can also do things, so I could take my, I could take what I did. So I could take that screenshot. Remember, I took that screenshot, and I could go over here. So let's say I've now wanted to create an activity out of this, so I could say, all right, actually, let's do this real quickly. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to just make another copy of it below, right here. And I'm going to use my eraser tool, and I'm just going to erase a part of it. And I'm going to create like an activity out of this, where now a student has to actually maybe fill these in like this. So maybe I don't want, I want to see, can they do that now? So I'm just going to take, an underline here and indicate to students, they need to fill in right here. They need to fill this in. They need to fill this in. They need to fill this in, for example, right? So I'm just kind of creating like a slow release of a responsibility to show them how to do it. So I take my screenshot here really quickly. And you could still use actually this exact same digital whiteboard, but just to show you Jamboard, because people might be familiar with it, you can go to set background, go to image, and then I'm just going to take that screenshot and I'm going to add this now as a background. And now when I added it as a background, it's fixed. So you'll see it can't be erased or anything like that. And now it's an interactive activity. So, if a student is in here, then they can actually fill this out. So they need to find the LCM, right? Doesn't matter. They don't need to be in class to be able to do this, right? They're just doing this practice activity. I can take this too, and there's different ways depending on your learning management system, but you can make a copy of this for every single student. So each student gets a copy, and then you can, just like the digital workspace here, you can just click in, to each one. You could have even taken the screenshot and put it in this program too, and then, be able to click in and see the students' work there. That's another option. You can also make these collaborative. So I could choose, I'm going to assign this just to like 4 people. I'm going to put their emails in, or do that through my learning management system, different ways you can assign things to multiple people. And then I could make this into a group-based activity where, I'm going to tell different students, and, maybe I set it up like partner 1 needs to write in yellow, and I'm going to tell partner 2 they need to write in green, something like that, to keep people accountable. And then, when the students are in there, the expectation is like the one person is writing in yellow or something like that. Again, it's another way to get students to work together and collaborate in a digital environment, regardless of whether or not, they're physically there with you. So hope that I was able to show you a few different strategies here for how you could think about technology, and again, I would encourage you to think about how it's less, in my opinion, how can we think even about, of course, there is this issue of like hybrid teaching, but how can we use the most effective instructional strategies that use technology to promote active participation, collaboration, self-paced learning, so that students are building their sense of autonomy and also understanding for themselves whether or not they get the key information, formative assessment so that I can see throughout an entire lesson what my students are doing, if they're understanding or not. Those are all just great teaching practices, and they're all practices and tools that can really help us create a very dynamic, awesome hybrid classroom. So hope that helped a little bit. And I have, if you're interested as well, if you check out our website, neotechclassroom.com, we have also downloadable stuff. And of course, our YouTube channel, Tech Classroom on YouTube, has full tutorials about every single program I showed you, and videos about hybrid teaching and blended learning and remote teaching and in-person teaching. So if you're interested in exploring any of this, I have videos that go much more in depth about all of them as well. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that fantastic presentation. It's great to see how you transitioned from some of the theory about hybrid teaching to sharing some apps, to then actually showing us real life examples of what you've been doing with your students. That's really informative. You've actually given me several ideas to work with myself that I may play with during the break and use in my classrooms next semester. I think particularly some of the points you've mentioned there about collaborative work, even when we go back to full-time in the classroom face-to-face teaching, when it comes to giving students project work, I think they can use some of those collaborative tools. That was brilliant. So thank you so much. And what I'll do is I'll share your channel in the chat box for those with us online now, but also when we edit this and upload it to YouTube, I'll make sure that we have in the description box links to your website and to your channel, because there's tons of informative, useful resources for us there. So thank you so much for that, Sam.
Very welcome.
Okay, thank you. Right, so our next speaker is Christopher Tuffnell. Unfortunately, he can't be here today. He's pre-recorded a video, but I noticed earlier when I was testing it out that the sound doesn't play so well if I play it live here. So what I'm going to do is share the link to his video in the description box, sorry, in the chat box here.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. I'm Chris Tuffnell, and I just want to start by apologising for not being synchronously present today. I'm currently in a very long quality assurance meeting with our Australian campus, but it does seem fitting that a webinar about blended learning has some asynchronous components. So here it is. And I'd like to start by thanking the British University in Dubai's Professor Hill and Dr. Charles for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. And in addition to our great friends' work at BUD, I'm also a huge fan of the work of Dr. Nadera over at AUD. And if I was there in person today, I'd be starstruck by the presence of Sam. His new EdTech channel is fantastic and has inspired me personally so much. So thank you for that, Sam, and I hope our audience here today subscribes to your content. Okay, so over to the presentation. So as mentioned, my name's Chris, and I'm currently working as the lead for innovative and digital education at the University of Wollongong in Dubai. In addition to this role, I also teach on the Masters of Education program. So my experience originates in the UK, and I've spent the last 13-14 years in the area of learning and teaching, with a focus on digital education, with a focus on learning design, and in recent years with a focus on particularly medical education, before I came to UOWD just over a year ago and took that broader scope across education disciplines generally. So the presentation here today is talking about some of that work I've been doing across the institution to help transition us towards blended learning. And I've split the presentation down into 4 areas: plan, pivot, proceed, and project. So first of all, we were talking about developing blended learning, maybe back in 2019, before I arrived anyway, as we were looking to move to a new campus, which we're now in, thankfully, in Dubai Knowledge Park. We wanted to rejuvenate and redevelop our teaching approach in line with this new campus. This is not just at the Dubai level as well. UOW, University of Wollongong, is based in Australia and has campuses in Dubai and Malaysia and Hong Kong as part of a global enterprise. And collectively, we all want to make this transition towards blended learning. But why? Well, it's not a new concept. I know some of the work done today in this webinar will look at defining what hybrid learning, blended learning is. But generally, I think the concepts, the beneficial concepts are the same. So from our student focus, we wanted to increase flexibility and really focus on the active and collaborative learning opportunities in the in-person space. From an organizational standpoint, this approach of more digitization will allow us to have a greater reach and visibility beyond the confines of physical campuses. And in turn, this will allow us to scale up our programs and really hopefully leverage the network that we have. So as mentioned, we could have programs that are delivered across the Malaysian, Hong Kong, Australian, Dubai campuses, elements of consistency, and then elements of localized expertise as well. For us here in Dubai, we started by focusing on 5 master's programs and 1 bachelor programs to start that slow incremental transition towards blended learning. But then COVID happened, and the best laid plans of mice and men often go wrong. I think that's a quote. COVID happens, and suddenly everybody was transitioned towards what we refer to as emergency distance learning. This had positive aspects in the sense of There was a very difficult period, I think, when educators had to transition their teaching into the digital space. And there's negative aspects as well. We really wanted to differentiate this experience from blended learning. This was an emergency measure that was not appropriately designed for, at least initially. So we want to separate these two things out. So how do we move forward then, considering our experiences through emergency distance learning and trying to implement our original plans towards blended learning? Well, we decided to implement an iterative design approach, very much kind of linking towards the design thinking methodology, in which we wanted to start to empower, to incrementally improve over time. So it's all well and good having, big plans with lots of detail. But as the disruption recently has taught us that sometimes flexibility is the key. So we believe that with our incremental, iterative approach to improvement, we can envisage our long-term plans, but on a much kind of rapid, quicker basis, and also addressing any issues that might come up as we go along. So underpinning our approach is incremental iterative improvement. And we launched a pilot at the beginning of the year, a flipped learning pilot, with the intended outcomes to really build capacity in our faculty and confidence in designing these blended learning, flipped learning experiences, and also to have more explicit focus on learning design, which wasn't present during emergency distance learning. So we went back to educators in these initial 6 programs, and we also added an extra 3 programs with educators that were showing interest in this approach. And again, generally what we're aiming to do is move away from a historical, traditional, teacher-led or purely teacher-led approach to education towards a more learner-centered approach. And therefore, our initial task, if you like, our initial challenge was to challenge the educator mindset and to talk about moving away from the thought of delivering content during a set time in a set location, and towards instead the being designers of learning experiences and what that looks like. And we've talked a lot about learning design, what it means to be thoughtful, considerate, and deliberate about our approaches to the design of learning experiences that are based on theory and evidence. And for us here at UOWD, we've really looked at a model of learning design that can help drive our transition towards blended learning. So we are utilizing the community of inquiry model and the universal design for learning approach. And we really believe that this will help us create quality blended learning experiences. In addition to the underpinning theoretical approach, one of the biggest questions we had as an institution is, what is blended learning? What does it mean to us? We know it's a 30-plus-year-old concept, but it has different definitions and different applications in different institutions. So just like the discussions here today, we talked about what are the key components that we want to see in our blended learning approach. Of course, there's going to be elements of instruction. We want to increase opportunities for active learning and collaboration. We want to identify more opportunities for assessment for learning, having more frequent lower stakes approaches to assessment. And sorry, just behind me there, a very important element of blended learning is the ability for students to become lifelong learners and take accountability and agency in their approach to learning through self-directed learning approaches. Okay, I'll just move myself back. Okay, so we talked about the key components that we want to see in our blended learning approach. Then to help us really get started, again, moving with an iterative model, let's set something out that people can experiment with. So we looked at one particular model, the flipped learning model, and we defined what the flipped learning model is. Now, a detailed definition of this model is hosted on a YouTube site that I'll bring your attention to in just a moment. But it basically looks something like this. So an original approaches to postgraduate study was to have 4 hours of synchronous live on campus delivery. Now in this model, we started to tackle the terminology a little bit. So we started talking in terms of synchronous versus asynchronous, as opposed to online versus face-to-face. We believe this is a more contemporary definition and gives a lot more flexibility in the blended approach. So synchronous, for example, is live delivery. That could be live on campus, could be live via WebEx or Zoom. And asynchronous learning opportunities are those that are self-directed and the student controls those experiences. So we took a traditional session and we started to ask our educators to think about within that session. So we're on the session level here. Is there, 30% of that session? So is there roughly an hour of that 4-hour session that you are delivering content that could be instead transitioned into the asynchronous space? So if I'm talking about concepts and I'm just talking at the audience, that actually could be packaged and delivered as self-directed videos or activities in a learning management system, for example. This then, with the addition of assessments to really understand, formative assessments, to understand what the students understood from that pre-session material. This will then give us opportunities for more active, engaging, collaborative learning opportunities in the remaining synchronous time. So one thing we really try and focus on is that blended learning is not an additive model. We're not adding on digital components. We're looking at a session structure and thinking about where we can repurpose and deliver content in a different way. So an example of this in practice is this finance session, where we identified that the educator was covering these 3 concepts of product cost versus period cost, cost classification, cost behavior. These were just delivering to the students what these concepts are. So we transitioned this delivery into video components that were then followed up by multiple choice questions. So the educator could see the students' understanding of those concepts. And then the live session started with discussions around this pre-learning material before she then went into an engaging, interactive, remainder of the session. So over time, a 10-week subject could be repurposed to be a blend of synchronous and asynchronous learning opportunities. But again, to support our educators in the transition towards this approach, we launched a pilot. So initially, the pilot articulated our approaches to flipped learning in this case, and it was supported by materials in the learning management system. It was supported by professional development opportunities, which I'll talk about, and we really tried to foster faculty learning communities. So this is these learning lounge updates where faculty are sharing and supporting each other by talking about challenges and successes that they've had. Again, this is by no means a final approach. The whole point of this pilot is to uncover the challenges as well as talk about solutions and approaches. And in addition to this, learning design support and consultation was offered throughout. So our approach to professional development to help step faculty towards this approach started with what we call nano learning. So these are short, bite-sized video chunks that aim to really just define certain concepts and approaches for us, and they were delivered through faculty email. So once a week, we talk about a different concept that we try and lock down into something that is appropriate for us. Now, all of these videos have been uploaded to a channel, again inspired by the new EdTech approach, that is called BLADE, and BLADE stands for Blended Learning and Digital Education. This content is available for you if you would like to look through, and hopefully you would find some useful information there. So in addition then to our nano learning approach, we also have provided micro learning opportunities. These are obviously a bit longer and in the form of either quick workshops, roughly 60 minutes, or e-courses that are self-directed and available for faculty to go through at their own pace. Again, equating to around 60 to 90 minutes of engagement or learning time. And then we've gone with also the more traditional workshop approaches that are a little bit longer and around certain themes, all with the aim to help develop and support the approach that we're going for. So this is a little insight into what the supporting Moodle site looks like, with various different resources and templates. And we're asking our educators to provide feedback and reflection as they go through this. So where we stand so far is looking something like this. We're just about to go into the third phase of our pilot. Phase 1 went from January to April, and it asked educators involved just to redesign 3 of their 11 sessions based on the support and guidance and templates and approaches that we'd spoke about. So again, this is the small incremental approach. So phase 1, just 3 sessions. Phase 2, which ran from April to July, we asked those same educators to redesign another 3 of those sessions in an 11-week subject or module. And we also added more educators on phase 2. So they were tasked with redeveloping 3, an initial 3 sessions. Then as we move into phase 3 of the pilot, which has started in September, we're again bringing more people on to redesign 3 subjects in their sessions, and by this time those educators that were involved in phase 1 and phase 2 are almost at the 6 or full session redesign. Now the reason I've color coded our dashboard like this is that firstly the red is for those educators that are just joining us in phase 3, so they've only redeveloped 3 sessions out of their 11 sessions in the subject. Now the rest of these sessions in orange here, they're going to stay like that until we've gone through some kind of evaluation of what's been happening. So the first 2 phases were focused on building faculty confidence as designers of blended learning experiences. Now we want to ensure quality as well, and this takes us to the phase 3. And once we've gone through phase 3, a lot of these subjects will start to turn green. So just to provide an overview of phase 3, we're looking at it from the perspective at the moment of really looking at the digital learning environment and what's been created and present there. In the future, in future iterations, we're going to look at the synchronous and the in-person delivery also. We're going to more consciously take on student experiences and feedback. Again, in the early stages of the redevelopment, we didn't really want to get too much feedback from the students because the sessions weren't fully redesigned. So it would be unfair, I think, to get students' feedback at that stage. But now, once we're going through a full session redesign, it's a perfect time to get student feedback. And then these 2 things combined can help us develop educator action plans for the future. So To review the digital learning environment, we've developed a tool called DUC, which is the Digital Uplift Check tool. And this is based on accreditation standards from TLAS organisation based in Australia. Now, what the educator would do, there's 4 categories here, and if you drop down each category, there's certain criteria where the educator has to look at their site, and there's either evidence of the element there, or there is no evidence and it needs to be created. So this then creates a report at the end that can be utilised to identify the gaps and what needs to be developed in the future. We do need to formalise student feedback in our subject evaluations and educator evaluations to really try and capture some of these elements of blended learning to give us that vital key stakeholder feedback from the student perspective. Then these 2 elements together can help inform an educator action plan. So you may be an educator that's redesigned your subject for blended learning. Then you go through the self-assessment tool for the learning management system side of things. We also get student data, and these 2 items combined will help form the basis of a learning design consultation in which either professional development will be identified if the same components keep cropping up, or for an individual educator to have an action plan, which they will then be supported with the redesign of their subject further and before meeting the quality expectations. Okay, so I'd just like to finish by talking about our future considerations for further iterations and phases in this pilot. Student preparedness is a big category that we need to develop. So blended learning is as a 2-sided coin when it comes to stakeholders, faculty members and their approaches to designing education, and also students and their approaches to receiving and engaging in learning opportunities. Again, sometimes students come from more traditional approaches where they expect to have one-way delivery of content. So supporting them to transition and align and really utilize the benefits of our approaches is going to be key. We need to think about further capacity development within the organisation and across the UOW network. Incentives is something that we need to discuss and think about, as well as investment. Okay, so thank you for your time, and if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you again for BUID and this opportunity to present with you today.
Okay, we have a short feedback form of just 2 questions, which we'd like you to fill in just to find out what you thought about today and the actual webinar. Hopefully we can take that and improve for future events. So thank you so much to Professor Christopher Hill for the speech, Dr. Nadera Alborno for her talk, Sam Kary joining us at midnight from California. Really appreciated that, and obviously also Chris Tuffnell and his video and his talk. And thank you to all the attendees for today. I think this was very informative, and I hope that together we can move forward with more discussions about different types of digital education strategies. Thank you.